empires project power through stone. The Great Wall stretches across the harsh northern frontier. Millions of soldiers guarded this staggering architectural military marvel. Imperial treasuries burned through unprecedented wealth to sustain them. Yet the financial bedrock of this massive defense wasn't glittering gold or silver. A biological necessity-funded slaughter. Every peasant needed this mineral to survive daily life. The imperial court monopolized it to bleed the populace. A mundane seasoning transformed into the ultimate fiscal weapon. By taxing the very chemistry of human survival, dynasties literally extracted military budgets from civilian blood. Let us unearth this bizarre and cruel economic machinery. Salt is life's invisible biological engine. The human body absolutely requires it to function properly. Without this mineral, muscles cramp and cognitive functions fail. Ancient agricultural societies relied on it to preserve harvests. When the state controls preservation, it holds the absolute power of life and death. Imperial economists realized that taxing a biological necessity guaranteed a perfectly inelastic, inescapable revenue stream.
Charge!
Emperor Wu faced a massive crisis. The Han Dynasty waged endless wars against northern nomads. Cavalry campaigns drained the imperial treasury at astonishing rates. Traditional land taxes simply could not fund the slaughter. Desperate to finance his military ambitions, the emperor nationalized the ancient salt boiling industries. This sweeping fiscal decree transformed a natural human resource into the exclusive property of the crown. Bureaucrats replaced the traditional market merchants. The state now oversaw the massive coastal evaporation pans. Inland brine wells fell under the strict imperial administration. Production quotas were enforced with absolute, unyielding military discipline. Laborers toiled in brutal conditions to produce the white crystals that funded distant border skirmishes. The government monopolized the point of origin, ensuring every single grain generated direct military capital. The math was terrifyingly, brutally simple. The state purchased raw salt at artificially depressed prices. They then sold it back at massively inflated rates. Official prices were sometimes 10 times the natural market. Civilians were forced into silent compliance, paying extortionate rates just to season their daily gruel. This structural price gouging effectively functioned as an invisible, yet universally applied poll tax on existence. The Great Wall consumed entire mountains. Millions of conscripted laborers required immense daily caloric sustenance. Garrisons stationed in barren wastelands depended entirely on logistics. Supplying the northern frontier was a logistical, financial nightmare. Every stone laid on that colossal northern defense was cemented by the silent suffering of peasants. Salt revenues bypassed traditional agrarian limits, allowing the dynasty to wage total war without immediate bankruptcy. The financial burden crushed the peasantry. Poor farmers could no longer afford adequate salt supplies. They ate tasteless food while their physical strength deteriorated. Preserving winter vegetables became a completely unaffordable, impossible luxury. The malnutrition quietly swept through the countryside as the poorest citizens were systematically priced out of survival. The macroeconomics of imperial defense directly catalyzed microeconomic physical degradation across the vast Chinese agricultural heartland. Confucian officials passionately debated this math. Scholars vehemently protested the state's aggressive, systemic financial predation. They argued the government should never compete with citizens. Profit-seeking was deemed entirely unworthy of a virtuous empire. These philosophical objections were violently ignored by military commanders desperate for constant cavalry and iron weapons. Moral economics inevitably surrendered to the pragmatic, insatiable fiscal demands of maintaining a sprawling, militarized empire. The Tang dynasty perfected this extortion. Centuries later, a massive rebellion heavily shattered the empire. The central government lost control of vital agricultural territories. Imperial survival demanded an immediate, massive influx of capital. Financial ministers turned once again to the salt monopoly, escalating the extraction to terrifying new heights. By controlling the eastern salt flats, the fractured state funded its own desperate, bloody political resurrection. Salt literally became the entire state. At its peak, salt generated half the empire's revenue. The imperial budget was completely addicted to this commodity. A vast bureaucracy existed solely to administer the monopoly. The Commission on Salt and Iron became the most powerful, feared institution in the entire dynasty. This specialized fiscal apparatus operated entirely outside traditional governance, functioning as a ruthless, revenue-generating shadow state. Enforcement required a brutal police force. The state established checkpoints along every major trade route. Rivers and canals were heavily patrolled by armed inspectors. Wagons and merchant ships were subjected to relentless searches. Ordinary citizens lived in constant fear of violent shakedowns by government agents hunting for untaxed minerals. The logistical administration of the tax necessitated the creation of an oppressive, omnipresent internal security apparatus. The penal punishments were absolutely draconian. Scraping salt from a dry lake bed became a felony. Boiling seawater in a private pot invited severe lashings. Possessing a single ounce of untaxed salt meant exile. Men were literally worked to death in penal colonies for the simple crime of seasoning meals. By criminalizing a basic human necessity, the state transformed millions of ordinary agricultural workers into criminals. The entire economy warped around salt.
Finally,
merchants were forced to purchase
license.
expensive official government
See that
licenses.
you conduct your business appropriately.
They bought state salt and handled the complex distribution. These wealthy merchants grew incredibly rich through sanctioned monopolies.
To our mutual
A
prosperity.
corrupt synergy formed between the
And
wealthy
discretion.
merchant class and the imperial bureaucrats managing the quotas. This system privatized logistical distribution while guaranteeing the state its massive, immediate, upfront military capital returns. The absolute poorest suffered the worst. Salt tax is fundamentally the most regressive economic policy. A beggar consumes the exact same amount as royalty. Therefore, the tax disproportionately consumed peasant income every day. Families sold their children into slavery simply to pay debts incurred by purchasing officially sanctioned salt. When fiscal policy leverages biological imperatives, it strips the lowest economic classes of their fundamental agency. Adulteration became a cruel, desperate practice. Corrupt officials routinely mixed dirt and sand into salt. This artificially increased the weight and inflated their profits. The peasants were forced to buy this toxic gravel. Eating government rations meant swallowing bitter soil, a daily physical reminder of the empire's absolute supremacy. The degradation of the commodity directly mirrored the systemic rot infecting the dynasty's bloated financial architecture. A highly dangerous threshold was crossed. The government pushed the artificial prices beyond human endurance. When people cannot afford to live, or they stop obeying. The risk of severe punishment suddenly outweighed the cost. Driven by the agonizing pain of deprivation, commoners began bypassing the official imperial distribution networks entirely. The extreme distortion of the natural commodity market inadvertently laid the foundation for a massive counter-economy. Vast shadow networks began to form. Secret routes bypassed the heavily guarded imperial canal checkpoints. Hidden salt pans operated under the cover of darkness. A highly organized criminal underworld replaced the state monopoly. Desperate peasants gladly purchased cheap, illicit salt from outlaws, silently funding the men who defied emperors. This economic subversion drained the military budget, redirecting the lifeblood of the empire into rebel hands. The smugglers became a shadow military. Armed gangs fiercely protected the lucrative, illicit trade routes. They recruited thousands of heavily marginalized, desperate rural outcasts. The state's aggressive fiscal enforcement inadvertently created hardened veterans. Men who previously boiled seawater now wielded heavy iron swords against imperial tax collectors. The dynasty's relentless pursuit of maximum revenue effectively organized, funded, and armed its own violent destruction. Huang Chao capitalized on this fury. He was a highly successful, wealthy black market salt merchant. He failed traditional civil service exams and deeply resented the court. His vast smuggling network provided instant, widespread logistical command infrastructure. He weaponized the profound economic misery of the overtaxed peasantry into an unstoppable, roaring insurgency. A localized economic grievance surrounding commodity taxation exploded into a catastrophic, empire-spanning military conflagration overnight. The rebellion shattered the Tang dynasty. Huang Chao's massive peasant army captured the glorious imperial capital. The emperor fled in absolute terror as the city burned. Centuries of accumulated, carefully hoarded imperial wealth was utterly obliterated. The citizens, brutalized by the monopoly, ultimately dismantled the entire imperial fiscal state. The state pushed the fundamental biological threshold too far, triggering an uncontrollable cascade of violent retribution. Salt revenue completely evaporated in chaos. The central government permanently lost control of the vital coasts. Warlords immediately seized regional salt pads to fund independent armies, and the unified economic engine of the vast empire fragmented irrevocably. Provincial governors hoarded the commodity, starving the crippled imperial court. Without the continuous flow of salt taxes, the magnificent imperial military apparatus starved. By anchoring its entire military survival to a single, easily smuggled necessity, the dynasty committed suicide. The financial butterfly effect was absolute. The monopoly designed to stabilize the borders instead destroyed the interior. Every copper coin extracted from salt weakened the agricultural foundation. Widespread famine inevitably followed the violent collapse of logistical trade networks. Families who could not afford government salt perished in the ensuing chaotic civil war. This economic paradox proved that extracting maximum fiscal efficiency frequently generates maximum societal instability and ruin. The capital city never fully recovered. Millions of people died during the catastrophic, decades-long military conflict. The Tang dynasty lingered as a hollow, completely bankrupt shell. Their grand imperial ambitions were buried beneath the heavily salted earth. The brilliant imperial economists who designed the perfect tax ignored the human breaking point. When governments monetize the biological will to live, they unwittingly finance their own violent, inevitable overthrow. The Great Wall still stands today,
Everyone look up.
but the fiscal machinery that built it is long dead. Modern nations rarely tax biological necessities with such brazen cruelty. We rely on complex income brackets and sophisticated digital tariffs. Yet the dangerous temptation to squeeze the poorest demographic for guaranteed state revenue remains. The ancient Chinese salt monopoly stands as a terrifying historical warning against entirely regressive economic policies. Governments always need more military capital. Wars constantly demand an endless supply of newly minted wealth. When traditional taxation fails, the state inevitably targets inelastic commodities. Politicians convince themselves that tiny, universal charges will go unnoticed. But history proves that extracting military funding from civilian survival guarantees eventual societal collapse. Taxing a biological necessity transforms the basic act of staying alive into a punitive financial transaction. The human cost was utterly incalculable. Millions suffered from chronic malnutrition just to fund distant cavalry. Generations of peasants were criminalized simply for seeking to eat. Their silent agony built the foundations of China's greatest monuments. We marvel at the vast architectural achievements, while completely forgetting the brutalized families who paid. Every grand imperial project conceals a hidden ledger written entirely in the blood of impoverished citizens. True power relies on fragile consent. The Tang dynasty believed their monopoly was an absolute right. They assumed the starving peasantry would simply endure the extortion. Instead, the desperate population turned to smugglers who shattered empires. When a state monetizes the chemistry of human survival, it breeds its own violent executioners. A government funding its survival by starving its poorest people has already forfeited its ultimate existence. The ledger closes on the dynasties. Their brilliant financial innovations ultimately orchestrated their absolute, fiery demise. Salt remains cheap today, but the terrifying economic lesson is priceless. Extracting national power from fundamental human vulnerability is fundamentally unsustainable. The true wealth of any nation relies entirely upon the physical stability of its poorest citizens. Imperial fiscal policy must recognize that pushing populations past the threshold of survival guarantees catastrophic ruin